Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we navigate the evolving landscape of environmental, social, and governance, ESG. Join me, Amanda Shea, Kaitlyn Allen, and Erica Schiller as we explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Allen, and today I am so excited to welcome Peter Zaman and Anna Stablum. Peter is with HFW, and I'm going to read his bio shortly. Anna is with ClimeCo, and we're here to discuss the results or lack thereof of COP28 and go really deep into some of the big questions around Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, how that affects carbon markets worldwide, and generally talk about all of the major underlying and perhaps overlaying issues, including political ones that are stalling progress in this space. So let me begin by introducing first Peter. Peter is a partner at HFW in Singapore. With over 20 years' experience as a transactional lawyer in the UK, EU, and Asia, Peter has developed a multifaceted practice spanning commodities, derivatives, structured products, and climate finance. He has been active in climate finance and environmental products markets since 2004. Most recently, Peter has joined the UNIDROIT working group on the legal nature of voluntary carbon credits. Then we also have Anna Stablum. Anna is ClimeCo's Business Development Director based in Singapore, where she's establishing a presence for ClimeCo in Southeast Asia. Most recently, as Commercial Director for Climate Impact X in Singapore, Anna was instrumental in developing one of the world's first exchanges for carbon, creating a spot trading platform for high-quality carbon credits. Peter, Anna, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us, Kaitlyn.
So let me begin with Anna. As ClimeCo's Singapore director, just wanted to start with telling us a little bit about what you're working on for ClimeCo in Singapore and lay some of that groundwork context, and then hear a little bit about high-level trends that you're seeing.
Thanks, Kaitlyn, for having me on the podcast together with Peter. As I said earlier, I'm a big fan of Peter and I love his insights into Article 6. And I read his paper that came out in February, and I thought we needed to have him on to be able to ask a little bit more questions around what the paper is actually saying. And also because we're seeing a lot of developments around Article 6 here in Singapore at this point of time, with clients actually now starting to buy credits with corresponding adjustments, and there are governments are writing letters of authorization that we know. And with all this, it's interesting, of course, to see where ClimeCo will fit in. And as a project developer, which markets will we sell our credits to? Will we sell credits with corresponding adjustment? Will we continue in the voluntary carbon market space? Where do we basically fit in this new, very fast changing environment? And that's where I think Peter has got great insights for us as well at ClimeCo to listen and learn how we can best benefit from this fast changing environment. So, like I said, there's a lot of focus out here in Asia on Article 6. We are seeing the Singapore carbon tax coming into force. So we're seeing the first contracts being signed now for credits, basically with buyers that fall under the carbon tax that you can pay 5% of your tax obligation in voluntary carbon credits. We are also seeing, of course, that a lot of the buyers that we had in the voluntary carbon markets had to now focus on compliance schemes. So what we've seen, for example, with the mining industry is that they have large operations in Australia, and as with the projects that they have there and that are coming up on stream, say iron ore, for example, they know that they will face compliance obligations. So we've seen a big shift in buyers basically going from buying voluntary carbon credits to putting all their resources and personnel on compliance schemes in, for example, Australia. And we're seeing it a lot more in other types of regions as well, with Korea, Japan, for example, making their frameworks clearer. So all of a sudden, decarbonization is no longer voluntary for many. It becomes a license to operate, and that needs to be prioritized. And I think sometimes, of course, we've seen a lot of scrutiny on carbon credits in the voluntary carbon markets, but I also think a lot of the buyers have stepped aside because they need to prioritize now what should their personal personnel really work on. And like I said, for example, with the mining groups, we see their whole carbon desk now working mainly on Australia just to figure out what are their priorities, and it's been interesting to see, and that's again why I would like to talk more to Peter about what happens with these credits that we're now seeing coming out in the market. So we're seeing some Rwanda cook stoves, for example, that are being sold with a letter of authorization, and there's a lot of uncertainty around buying these credits, and I think that's something that we can talk to Peter about today and get a little bit more of a clear framework of where are the risks and how do you cope with all these risks coming to market. And of course we're seeing Corsia, and that's obviously the mandatory scheme for the airlines, and where does that fit under Article 6? I'm super happy to have Peter here today and to talk more about what he sees and the developments that he's following. And of course that paper I thought was very interesting.
Yes, and the paper. So you've mentioned it twice. So I want to explain what that is. So after COP28, Peter and colleagues have published a paper that was actually just published this month, February 2024. And the title is COP28, The Failure to Reach an Article 6 Decision and the Inconvenient Truth. And really excited to dive in with Peter a little bit more on this because it's fascinating topic. But first, before we head over to Peter, I wanted to ask Anna her opinion, what kind of prompted, what caught your attention so much about the paper that you thought, oh my gosh, we have to have Peter on? What was it that grabbed your attention?
Well, what I thought was very interesting was the idea of how political these negotiations are. And of course, we have the European Union, and we're all following what they are doing in the space of, we have the carbon border adjustment mechanism coming out. So that's something as well that we're following. And as you know, Kaitlyn, that ClimeCo is a big advisory in all sorts of ESG related matters. And there will be companies out here wondering how can they prepare for CBAM, as it's called, when it comes into force. So that's another development that we're following closely out here in Singapore for ClimeCo. How are corporates positioning themselves with regulation coming out of the EU? And I think Peter was talking a lot about the EU in this paper and how they position themselves and how this will work. CBAM, and also they're now setting up, and we saw this week news coming out from Europe that they're setting up their own removal registries. So again, that's something I would like to talk to Peter about. How will this registry fit in the market, and how is their position, the European Union's position on removal credits, and why is it so strong? Why are they focusing so much on removals when the rest of the world and the urgency that we're facing really feels like reductions is good enough for now? And we need to, of course, invest in removals coming up to 2050. But why do they focus so much on getting investments into removal credits at this point of time? And again, those were kind of the key topics that I thought from this paper, how the European Union went to COP, how they, in some instances, voted against certain decisions. And yeah, I also sometimes feel, why did they not come up with this earlier during the negotiations of the Paris Agreement? Why are they coming in a little bit last minute and not supporting the agreement moving forward with Article 6? But yeah, I will leave it to Peter to explain to us.
And now everyone can understand why this is such a deep topic. And with no further ado, Peter, welcome. And please, I know Anna said about probably 15 things that we want you to respond to. But why don't we start with your experience of COP28? I mean, you were there. What were you feeling there? And then what led you to write this paper explaining your position on this?
I think the trick in me trying to live up to that introduction is also to try and figure out, where do I start in responding, because there are a lot of things that Anna's been referencing that I feel like talking about as well. So maybe I'll just lead with your first point about COP28 and expectations going in versus what happened afterwards. So just before going into COP28, I certainly had a very pessimistic view about what would happen in respect of Article 6. I mean, we've got to recognize that COP28 had a much bigger agenda than just COP28, just the Article 6 stuff. The global stock take was a very, very big aspect of what the agenda for COP28 was going to be. And I think it's right that the presidency focused on that. But it did, by the cost of its press focus on that, mean that it didn't really try and push forward or put its political clout behind pushing for an Article 6 conclusion. So Article 6 landed up being the sort of forgotten child of COP28 a little bit. I wasn't necessarily expecting that to happen, if I'm being honest. A lot of it is because there were not that many controversial issues. There were some controversial issues going into COP28. The Article 6.4 Supervisory Board, which is responsible for the 6.4 mechanism, had been meeting for all of the 2023 period. And although they were making slow progress, they were still making progress towards getting Article 6.4 operational. And the EU is a big group of a big negotiating group in that part in the Article 6.4 Supervisory Board. So there wasn't anything on the agenda for 6.4 that should have taken the EU by surprise, but nonetheless, the EU suddenly took a position that they hadn't taken throughout most of the year. And that caught a lot of people by surprise because they expected that all the technical heavy lifting on what is the removals methodology, what should be the position adopted at the framework level for determining new methodologies, all of that work was already done. So you'd expect there to be a little bit of rubber stamping, so to speak, by the remaining countries who have delegated through their nomination of representatives to the 6.4 Supervisory Board. The fact that they're the ones who've gone through the technical debate, and that's the recommendation they're putting to the CMA, and the CMA should just rubber stamp it because that's exactly why they delegated it to a group of people who are looking at the technical issues. So the fact that there was
CMA, Peter. Sorry.
So this is the Conference of the Parties meeting as parties to the Paris Agreement. And this is because COP meetings are meetings not just of Paris Agreement parties, but also people like Kyoto Protocol parties. And the COP is an umbrella term for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, under which the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol both existed. Or Kyoto Protocol existed and the Paris Agreement currently exists. So hence the CMA. So what you have is a group of countries meeting, and what you'd expect at that point to say is, you know what, we've trusted our colleagues to come up with a recommendation. They've looked at the weeds. Unless there's anything in this that really doesn't make sense to us, we're just going to have to trust their judgment on it. And generally speaking, you don't try and undo the efforts of the people who you've delegated the job of making a recommendation to throughout the year, particularly when the people undermining it and questioning it are the very people who participated in the process. Hence the surprise that the EU pulled a fast one at the last minute. And I think that took a lot of negotiators by surprise because the EU had plenty of opportunities to bring it up. And nowhere in their conversations throughout the year have they really pushed the line that they pushed when they turned up at Dubai. And for that, you've got to break down and recognize that there are two different lines they were pushing. They were pushing one particular line on Article 6.2, 6.2 being the separate mechanism for cooperative approaches, which is much more a bilateral or multilateral arrangement that countries themselves can develop towards agreeing approaches that are recognized under the framework of the Article 6 process, which of course then allow internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, international carbon credits, to be generated. And that 6.2 position is different from the 6.4 position. And the EU had two different approaches for issues that they had in respect of either of those two systems. And the two were unrelated in the sense that the EU's negotiating objections to 6.4 and the EU's negotiating objections for 6.2 were, broadly speaking, different objections. And that's what made it even more difficult to try and figure out, because it's not like the EU was saying things both in the 6.2 and 6.4 negotiations with wearing exactly a common hat. And they were objecting to different things at different points. And of course, a lot of the negotiators who turn up at COP28 sit both in the 6.2 and the 6.4 process. And they're scratching their heads wondering, why are these guys making this point here and are not making it there? And why is this issue such a big issue here and not there? And people were just surprised, and people just couldn't understand why the EU were taking this position. And of course, you've got to remember that historically, the United States has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. It sat out the Kyoto Protocol CDM mechanism. The US isn't the guy who has led climate policy. That's historically fallen to the EU. So here you have the bulwarks or the champions of progressive climate policies actually trying to block success or progress of Article 6, both 6.2 and 6.4. And you're scratching your head if you're one of the other parties saying, why are you doing this? Usually you guys are the ones who are pushing for us to do more emissions trading, more carbon pricing, more of the EU ETS type stuff. And here you are when we're trying to do it, actually telling us not to do it. So that left a lot of people scratching their heads afterwards. And I think that's the context in which I came away from COP28 probably bemused more than anything else, and tried to understand what exactly had driven the EU's position. Because I'm not one of those guys who believes that people are stupid and they do insane things. It's not at this level. I think when people are doing something at this level, usually there's a reason for it. It took me a while to figure out what that reason was, and hence I didn't do what a lot of other people did, which is a day after COP28 come out with a paper that summarizes this is the takeaway from COP28. I just don't believe in doing that. I like to go away, think about things, and if I say something, try and say something meaningful. So, but it took me a good 3 months to figure out what was going on, and hence the delay in publishing this in February rather than earlier.
I appreciate the pause to think. I think that if everyone did that, wouldn't we live in a very different world and a much better place? So I just had to say that. Please continue.
Thank you. Okay, so I suppose with that broad point about COP28, what I thought about it and what drove the paper, I suppose the next place in which to start is probably to talk a little bit about the fact that historically, again, because the US has been in and out of climate negotiations in the way that we've seen in the past, when the EU and the US have taken negotiating positions at the COP, generally speaking, they've been aligned. This time they were not. This time the US pushed against the EU position, which again was also a little bit of a break in tradition. And you've got to ask yourself, so what changed? Why is it that the US suddenly were not necessarily supportive of the EU position on this? And again, that also requires a little bit of pausing and thinking, because something must have changed in that dynamic. And if there was enough to change that dynamic, then there must be enough of an issue with the US opinion about the EU position as much as the rest of the world's view on the EU position. So again, if you start looking at the drivers behind these different reasons, what you often realize is that the common issue that the US has objected about to the EU and the EU's climate policy over the course of the last months leading up to COP28 has actually been CBAM. Because, the EU objects to the way the US have introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, because they believe that it's a sort of a carrot that draws in a lot of investment capital out of Europe and out of the rest of the world into the US. And the EU's approach to climate policy is, I'm going to wave a stick at the emitters within the EU and I'm going to force them to behave in a certain way. So you have two diametrically opposite climate policies. The US one is to say, I'm going to dangle a carrot and people are going to do the right thing. And the EU's one is, I'm not going to dangle a carrot, I'm going to wave a big stick and force people to do the right thing. So you have two conflicting climate approaches and climate policies clashing there as well. And the EU's CBAM policy, as the EU have subsequently and a lot more blatantly admitted, is an attempt to export the EU carbon price to the rest of the world. And actually, CBAM, the carbon border market adjustment mechanism, is at its infancy in the sense that right now, all you're doing is reporting the emissions associated with certain types of commodity products that you are and goods that you're importing into the EU. But over time, not only will the scope of the products that you import and therefore have to report emissions on get more complex and get greater, But from, I think, if memory serves right, 2026, you're going to have to start surrendering CBAM certificates. And CBAM certificates are not EU allowances. They're not voluntary carbon credits. They are a type of instrument that will be issued by the European Union. And the price of a CBAM certificate is going to align itself with the EU allowance price at the time. And what CBAM says is that any outside country that doesn't have a carbon price equivalent to the EU has to top up this by buying CBAM certificates, i.e. at EU allowance prices, equivalent to the greenhouse gas carbon footprint associated with the commodity or the product that they're importing into the EU. So steel is a simple example. You've got Indonesian steel being exported from Indonesia into the EU. EU has its own steel. So EU steel makers are subject to the EU emissions trading scheme. They have to buy allowances to match the carbon associated with their steel production. Indonesia doesn't have a carbon price that's anywhere near the carbon price of the EU ETS. And therefore, if you are a European steelmaker, you are complaining that Indonesians are getting an easy ride compared to them because they don't have to pay an EU carbon allowance price for the cost of the steel that they've produced, and therefore they have an unfair advantage. And historically, what the EU has done is that they've recognized that there are at-risk sectors. In other words, there are competitive areas where certain EU ETS scope sectors are at disadvantage of what's called carbon leakage. Carbon leakage is simply steel production will move out of the EU and go to countries necessarily in the border of the EU or further afield if you don't protect these sectors that fall within the EU ETS by giving them free allowances. But the EU's also committed itself to a 2050 net zero goal. And a 2050 net zero goal means you can't be giving away free carbon allowances. At some point, you've got to decarbonize the steel sector. But how do you protect the steel sector for decarbonization if you're taking away carbon allowances? And the only way in which the EU could therefore figure out a solution was to basically say, well, we'll penalize anybody who doesn't have an equivalent carbon price by bringing goods into the EU. So CBAM is an attempt to try and do that. But if you think about it, what CBAM is saying, therefore, is that I think Indonesian steel should have a carbon price attached to it equivalent to the EU price. And I would say in general, that's fine if that's what the EU wants and Indonesia wants, but then you do bilateral trade agreements between yourselves to agree that. At the Paris Agreement level, it's very difficult for you to insist that Indonesia's carbon price should be the same as the EU's carbon price, because the Paris Agreement has an article enshrined in it that recognizes that countries who are participating in the Paris Agreement process have common but differentiated responsibilities in terms of how they align their common goals for the purposes of the EU ETS. Now, if you are Indonesia and your common goal is eventually to reach net zero, the question is your net zero objective the same as the EU's net zero objective? Are you required to achieve net zero by 2050? And if so, do you have any scope for differentiation? And the argument historically in the Kyoto Protocol was to divide the world between developed countries, which were typically the Annex B countries to the Kyoto Protocol, and everybody else fell in a common bucket, which was non-Annex B countries. And frankly, they had no Kyoto Protocol obligations. And within the Kyoto Protocol, you gave special treatment to what are otherwise called least developed countries. Now, the Paris Agreement did away with all of that. You know, we don't have an Annex B, non-Annex B divide anymore. We all have common goals. But it's also recognized because of the sort of, concern around climate justice and the fact that the Western world, broadly speaking, has been, or the global north has been very much responsible for the cause of the climate problem because they burnt cheap coal and therefore they were able to produce wealth and generate wealth through energy production much more cheaply than other countries could. And now we're asking those countries, don't burn coal, which is cheap. We want you to do expensive things like develop renewable energy capability for solar and wind. And by the way, we're not going to pay you for any of that. We just expect you to do it anyway. So the general thrust has been in all international climate agreements, including the Paris Agreement, to recognize that people will do this at a differentiated pace. And therefore, the divide in the Paris Agreement is between developed and developing. There is no least developed category, it's developing countries. Now, on that basis, you would argue that you wouldn't compare the EU with Indonesia, right? Because you would never say that the financial capability of the EU and the financial capability of Indonesia or India are exactly the same. And therefore, is it appropriate that Indonesia or India should be obliged to have an 80 euro a ton carbon price if that is the price in euro at the time? And the answer to that has to be no. And that's where I say that one of the problems with this, with the CBAM approach, is that it has no flex in terms of recognizing Indonesia's position and India's position relative to the EU's position. And that's where I think that CBAM isn't consistent with the rights of those developing countries in the context of the Paris Agreement. And a lot of what the paper focuses on is to highlight that the EU's approach probably isn't consistent with that. And actually, if you take that right, which is enshrined in the Paris Agreement, as being something that these governments have and other countries are entitled to, then it's not really appropriate for the EU to force their carbon price down other people's throat. Now, if the EU were to say, look, on a bilateral deal basis, Indonesia, I'm going to let you do this. And by the way, all the proceeds that I charge from your imports, I'm going to put back into adaptation funding, which will directly be given back to you, Indonesia. On that basis, would you say this is acceptable? That's a matter for Indonesia. And at that point, I think it's purely within their gift and their choice if they want to waive away their protections otherwise given to them under the Paris Agreement. But no such conversation is happening. In fact, if you go back to one of the earlier drafts of the CBAM provisions that the EU are negotiating, the question of what do you do with the CBAM certificate money came up. And there was a draft provision that says we're going to put it into an adaptation fund and help countries who are otherwise needing support use the money for that purpose. They took it out. They didn't put it into the final version. So what does that tell you, right? I'm going to pause there.
So they will take all the money for themselves, the EU, and put into their own continent, potentially.
I would say yes and no. What I think the EU are saying is that, okay, I will put that money for myself if I want to. It's my business. If you don't want me to put that money for myself, you're most welcome to start taxing your own citizens. Put up, Indonesia has a carbon price of $2 a ton. Make that $80 a ton. Then you get to keep all the money. You don't have to give it to me. But that goes back to...
And this is what we're seeing a little bit, right? So India is considering maybe having their own CBAM scheme. The UK, of course, is going with their CBAM scheme. Yeah. So they're exporting basically a policy measure for everybody else. But the question is, can they afford it if you compare to what we also discussed? And maybe it's also in the paper that obviously to decarbonize a ton of CO2 in the EU will cost a lot more than to decarbonize in other developing countries.
Yeah. And that very neatly, I think, it starts us talking about removals versus reductions, right? Because if you think about the practical element of what we're trying to achieve within the idea of a net zero concept, we're basically saying we need to emit less and therefore reduce the amounts of emissions from all the sources of emissions that we have, and eventually recognize that even if we do that, it may not be enough because there are going to be hard to abate sectors, aviation, shipping being two examples, where we're going to still have emissions. And the Paris Agreement actually recognizes the problem. It says, you know what? The idea of the Paris Agreement is that on a net global basis across all the countries in the world, we need to have an equivalent amount of emissions with an equivalent amount of removals. And that is the idea of net zero by 2050, if you will. So actually, if you think about the objective of what we're trying to do, both at the EU and anywhere else in the world, is we're recognizing that there are going to be emissions post 2050, no matter what. And that's the reason why India can have a net zero goal that isn't 2050, it's 2070. because the idea is that some countries in the world should be able to continue to emit after 2050, because the idea is that the countries that can afford removals should be increasing the amount of removals to compensate for the emissions that are still occurring after 2050. So we're in this very interesting situation where that's clearly what the Paris Agreement contemplates, but there's no exercise in trying to allocate that budget between the countries. And because there has been no top-down allocation of that budget the way the Kyoto Protocol did, everybody's scrambling to see how much they can burn as quickly as they can burn, and therefore leaving somebody else to pick up the tab for holding the baby, right? That's broadly what the Paris Agreement's limitation is. And then the idea of the global stocktake and the idea that different countries publish their nationally determined contributions is that we make sure that we have enough people doing the right amount of reductions and the right amount of removals eventually, compared to the people who are still continuing to emit in other parts of the world. So you do have this situation where nobody's having the right conversation about how that should be allocated. And in the absence of a conversation around that allocation, you get to this position where it's a bit of a free-for-all. And the free-for-all is a necessary consequence of a bottom-up approach of the Paris Agreement that says, I'm not going to dictate what you're going to do. You're all going to do it, but you're all going to do it at your own pace. And the EU's CBAM policy kind of rides roughshod over that principle, because it's saying, no, 2050 is the deadline. You all have to do a lot more now. And if you don't do a lot more now, we're all in trouble. So you're all going to follow it by it taking on a much bigger carbon price today than you're necessarily ready to do. But ironically, if you read the press in any time in the last 3 months, you see protests from farmers in the EU, in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands. You see Polish farmers angry at the EU because of what their carbon policy is doing for farming. You see people backtracking on green pledges. Germany has finally woken up to some of the extreme costs that they're legislating for. One of the examples is the corporate due diligence directive that they're trying to introduce for the supply chains to try and ensure all products acquired meet a certain due diligence criteria for supply chain acquisitions. And there's now hesitation because politicians are recognizing how much additional cost burden that's going to put on companies. There is ultimately a question that the EU is skirting around, which is how expensive is this going to be for the EU to do if they want to implement these policies? And look, if the EU can afford it, great. But the protests tell me that they're not necessarily sure they can afford it. And there's clearly pushback now for a lot of these policies because it's expensive. And one way for the EU to mitigate that cost, to make it less expensive, is to buy Article 6 credits from abroad, because Article 6 credits from abroad achieve a GHG mitigation benefit that is cheaper elsewhere than it is within the EU. So why not use Article 6 credits? But they refuse to do that. And not only have they refused to do that, but actively, as we've seen at COP28, they're trying to stop Article 6 from happening. So now you've got this really interesting position that says, why are you stopping Article 6 credits from happening? Why are you not buying Article 6 credits yourself? And why are you taking on this big cost burden for yourself? And not only are you doing that, but by you not buying, you're actually depriving other countries who could be supplying these carbon units to countries like the EU, UK, US, the much needed climate finance that they need to help them all achieve their own net zero objectives. They can then maybe afford solar and wind because somebody is subsidizing it, but the subsidy isn't coming from you because you're not buying Article 6 credits. So how are you expecting them to take on the cost for all of this when you are not willing to help subsidize any of it? So that takes you to this really interesting position that in one sense, the EU is cutting its nose to spite its face by saying, no, we're going to completely decarbonize on our own. We're not going to pay anybody else any subsidies to assist us to mitigate that cost. We're going to bear all of this cost ourselves. And we're wonderful for doing so, but we're also going to force you through CBAM to do the same. And that's kind of where the EU's position is taking them. Contrast that with what's happening in the US, where money from all over the world is pouring into the US because they're essentially waving a carrot rather than a stick. The decarbonization benefits that should follow from that, both to the economy, the technology, and everything else, may or may not be equivalent to what the EU are trying to do, but it's definitely a different approach. And it's certainly a much more politically palatable approach for people who are US citizens and, in fact, global citizens. Australia has woken up to the fact that if they are not careful and they don't try and create equivalent incentives for domestic users who want to achieve similar or green transition incentives, they're going to lose out on it. So they're now talking about matching their own equivalent of an IRA in Australia. And I think that's an interesting way to think about the ideological battle that's going on across the world between what is the best way to achieve energy transition. One way, carrot, the other way, stick. Stick has consequences, and what my paper really focuses on is what are the consequences of what happens when the EU decides to apply the stick to the rest of the world.
I find that fascinating. Sorry, Peter, to jump in there. I just wanted to ask you, how does it tie in with, for example, Sweden going and setting up an agreement with Ghana? How does that? What are they trying to do within this EU framework? They're still trying to buy some cheaper ways of decarbonizing?
Yeah. So very good question, but it left me scratching my head as well. And I spoke to actually a client recently who was able to shed some light on that for me. So as you know, the EU has a common Paris Agreement NDC, which means that the EU member states have all agreed that they would share amongst themselves the burden of how do they achieve their Paris Agreement objectives. And that burden is aligned with their EU ETS policy. So in other words, they've delegated to Brussels or the European Commission to say, it's your job to tell us what we collectively all need to do amongst us to try and collectively meet the Paris Agreement objectives. So Sweden, who's an EU member state, is a bit of an outlier when it goes off and does its own bilateral deals under Article 6.2. So you're absolutely right to raise the question. What I've been told, and I hope this is correct, is that what Sweden has said is that we're actually going to go above and beyond what our NDC commitments are. And therefore, we want to put in place a 6.2 framework under which we can acquire ITMOs on a bilateral basis to enable us to go beyond what our NDC commitments are. And that's why they're doing it.
That's helpful. And do you think we will see more European countries? Have you heard anything? Would someone like Germany do that?
No. I don't see I mean, not unless there's a change in government in Germany. You have to remember the German government position is very much influenced by the fact that they are in a coalition, and parties like the Social Democrats don't get to call the shots all the time. Sometimes they have to give way to what the Green Party insists on, and the Green Party has found itself into a very convenient and influential position in German policy and German politics. So actually, a lot of what you're seeing coming out of Europe is also supported and encouraged by the fact that the German government today is a coalition government.
I just wanted to ask about the removal news that we saw and the registry that the EU is then setting up themselves. And there seemed to be a few people surprised that they were actually including more not so long lasting or a little bit more in a temporary scope than what was originally thought. And I thought to myself, do you think that would soften and the alignment with Paris, the fact that they will have a registry that would have, for example, biochar, and do you have any? It just came out, so I don't know exactly how much you're.
Yeah, I haven't seen, or rather, I haven't read the very final version. Apparently, that has been agreed between the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament. I think we're waiting to see the final version of that text, and I tend to like waiting for final legislation before I start speculating on what it really means. But I did read the original Commission proposal, and the original Commission proposal clearly, for the purposes of its removals position, drew a very sharp distinction, which I think still has been maintained in the most recent agreement, between what they considered to be geological storage solutions and non-geological removal storage solutions. And broadly speaking, the difference is in a geological storage solution, they anticipate permanence to be centuries worth. We have to measure permanence in hundreds of years. So anything that doesn't meet that criteria is basically non-permanent. And actually, one of the very, very interesting things about the EU emissions trading scheme, which is the EU's primary policy on how it both wanted to achieve its Kyoto Protocol objectives as well as how it meets its Paris Agreement objectives, is that the EU ETS works on the basis of positive emissions, i.e., you are allowed to emit, but up to a certain limit. There is no concept within the EU ETS that says, oh, by the way, if you remove a ton out of the atmosphere, the ton that you have emitted can be neutralized, i.e., one offsets the other. You don't have that concept in the EU ETS today. Yet, if we are going to move towards a world of a sort of a net zero, eventually, as we know from even the most recent sort of ideas of the 2040 climate policy objectives that the EU have published, you're going to get to a position where there are going to be no more EU allowances because you can't have free allocation and still have net zero. So what you're going to get is a situation where for hard to abate emissions or remaining emissions, any corporate who still has an emission ton is going to have to use some kind of removal credit to neutralize or offset the impact of that ton. Then the question is, what kind of offset are you allowing in? And in the world of offsets, where you have reductions and you have removals, within removals, you now have two different categories. Clearly geological, very much permanent removals, and the slightly more less permanent ones. And that can be broken down into different methodologies, biochar, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're really seeing here, and this again is reflected in the sort of EU position on 6.4 as well, is that the EU is saying that for the purposes of the EU emissions trading scheme, if I'm going to allow corporates to not be penalized for emitting a positive ton of emissions, and I'm going to accept that there is a -1 that neutralizes the effect of that or offsets the effect of that, I have to have confidence in the removal itself. And therefore, the only removal that I have been told that I'm entitled to have confidence in, because I've had a bunch of academics advise me on this issue, and I've got a bunch of policy papers that say this, is geologically stored emissions. So I have to prioritize investment in geologically stored emissions because it's the only one that's consistent with an EU ETS. So in one sense, you've got a problem that is artificial. And I'll read a sentence that very much caught my eye from a paper I was reading. And it's a paper that came out in November 2023, and it's called Governing Permanence of Carbon Dioxide Removal, a Typology of Policy Measures. And it's published by an organization called CORE. And I think I mentioned it in the paper, my Paris Agreement paper as well. And this is the quote that really, really caught my eye. It says, in order to enhance liquidity and maintain their role as a cornerstone of UK and EU climate policy, ETSs must successfully evolve to include CDR and transition from a positive to a net zero compatible emissions trading system. In part, CDR inclusion is being driven by these pressures, rather than whether the policy is a first best solution to financing the net negative economy. So what they're saying is, because of the way a EU ETS is designed, the EU is being forced to support much more permanent storage solutions, which are much more expensive, $200 plus a ton, and therefore ignore the question of whether or not there is a cheaper way to achieving net zero, which is using ARR, afforestation, reforestation credits, biochar credits, etc., as a means of achieving net zero. And I find that a very, very interesting take on one of the consequences of EU carbon policy. They've basically made a rod for their own back now by saying that because we have a positive cap and trade system that is not compatible with a net zero world, The only way I can make that compatible is by retrofitting this $200 a ton, very, very expensive removal approach. And more importantly, as my position in COP28 has mandated, I insist the rest of the world do the same.
It's really so impactful. I certainly, speaking for myself, in reading to your point, the things that come out right after COP and the overviews certainly did not get so clearly the message that I'm hearing today from you, Peter. I have a follow-up question. So we've been speaking a lot about the compliance type credits, the ITMOs, Article 6. Actually, one of my questions was going to be, is the ITMO the same thing as the Article 6 credit?
So there are two types of Article 6 credits. You have credits that are generated from the 6.4 mechanism, which are called 6.4 emission reductions. And any credit that is a 6.4 emission reduction when transferred internationally behaves from a regulatory perspective equivalent to an internationally transferred mitigation outcome. But the internationally transferred mitigation outcome, or ITMO, is the currency or the unit that you get through a 6.2 arrangement. So through a bilateral cooperative or multilateral cooperative approach.
Okay, I know I'm not going to be the only person rewinding to listen to you say that 8 times. Thank you very much for explaining that. But the deeper question I was going to get to is, so we've talked a lot about these compliance credits, but given all of this context about the EU, do you think that the demand from corporations within the EU that's typically there for voluntary credits will just dry up? Or how will demand for the voluntary credits be affected? Well, first within the EU, but then in the rest of the world because of these forthcoming changes.
I think this touches on the point that Anna was mentioning in her introduction about what we call the transition from voluntary into compliance. And again, I think this is where, what Singapore is doing is interesting, and it's an example of how it's being done. But broadly speaking, and again, I make this point in the paper, the Paris Agreement target, I won't even say legally binding target, but the stated target that was agreed in Paris in 2021 was, at COP21, was in fact an agreement to limit it to below 2 degrees. 1.5 degrees came after Paris. So what happened is that people went away, small island states in particular said, below 2 degrees doesn't help us because by then we'll be underwater. If you don't hold it to 1.5 degrees, we're finished, broadly. So everybody went away and said, okay, we agree what you were going to say. We're going to instruct people to go and figure out what 1.5 degree requires us to do. And clearly, therefore, outside of the Paris Agreement itself, there was a tacit agreement that people should try for 1.5 degrees, but try, right? So the notion that countries would adopt something more stringent than what is otherwise written in the Paris Agreement is essentially a country's voluntary commitment. Some countries have voluntarily committed to do that, the EU being a good example. Other countries haven't. And part of the reason those countries haven't is because of common but differentiated responsibilities. So the countries that have committed to it have agreed to do so voluntarily. And therefore, the theory is that they're taking on positions that are much more consistent with the 1.5 degree peaking of emissions, which means that you have to peak emissions earlier than if you were aiming for below 2 degrees. So if you're peaking emissions by 2030, like the EU is, there are certain things you have to do to make sure that after you peak your emissions, you have a rapid decline in your emissions between 2030 and 2050 to the point where when you hit 2050, the amount of your emissions and the amount of your removals are aligned with each other. They equate to each other. So that's the idea of a net zero. Now, because a lot of countries haven't, or a lot of governments haven't made the net zero commitment, the voluntary corporate commitment is to make up voluntarily the shortfall that the countries haven't committed to. So then it becomes a question of whether or not Tata Steel, which is an Indian company as an example, wants to voluntarily, for its carbon footprint in the corporate emissions that it is responsible for, despite being an Indian company, whether or not it would nonetheless take on a voluntary corporate commitment. And of course, the answer to that is, if you're if you're Tata Steel, you may wish to do so. And I can't tell you from the top of my head whether or not they have or not, but let's imagine that they have. Now, if you are then Tata Steel, the only question is, on a voluntary basis, what kind of credits should I be surrendering? And if it's a voluntary market and you are looking to meet a voluntary corporate commitment, arguably they can be any credit you want to be. They can be voluntary, they can be compliance. After all, at the end of the day, no one's telling you you have to do this. Unless you're an NGO, in which case you have a very critical view about what Tata Steel is doing, in which case you do give yourself the authority to tell Tata Steel that they're not doing it the right way. So what you get is not so much governments telling you what you can do and what you can't do, but NGOs dictating what you should do and what you shouldn't do, because they otherwise accuse you of greenwashing. So what we in fact are seeing is the notion of all corporate entities being scared away from doing the right thing, voluntary initiatives, because the NGOs have taken a position that any carbon offsetting is bad. They're not just saying you can't carbon offset using great and wonderful credits. They're not saying that. They're basically saying carbon offsetting is inconsistent with the idea that you are decarbonizing. And if decarbonizing is what we want to do, then we don't want you to have an easy get out by buying cheap offsets. So the idea is that offsetting is bad. It's not so much a question of whether or not you're doing the right offsets or the wrong offsets. There are clearly good offsets out there and clearly not so good offsets out there. That's not the point. The point is, in their mind, any offsetting is broadly bad. So if you take the SBTI position, right? SBTI, it has been signed up to by a large number of corporates. From last recollection, I think there were 7,000 applicants, corporations who wanted to apply to be SBTI aligned.
And
if you're
SBTI, science-based target initiative. Please continue.
That's right, the Science-Based Target Initiative. So SBTI is a voluntary commitment that corporates can sign up to. SBTI doesn't allow you to use carbon offsets at all towards meeting your Scope 1, Scope 2 emission reduction targets. For Scope 3, they will say, we won't allow you to do reduction credits. We will only allow you to use removal credits up to a limit of 10%, and only towards the very, very end of your target. So in other words, if you are a company that set a corporate target for 2040, if by 2038 you haven't been able to completely decarbonize, at that point we might let you use up to 10% of your target, meet your 10% of your SBTI target using removals only. So you get to this point where SBTI has basically said, no offsetting at all, please. We just don't believe in the stuff. If you are going to use them, I'll reluctantly allow you to use some removals, but only up to 10% of your overall Scope 3 emissions target, which is a very, very small amount, which sends a very, very weak signal to anybody who's in the removal space today that says, by the way, today I can invest a lot of money for a $200 a ton emission reduction because there will be voluntary corporate demand for it maybe in 2038, 2039. So again, it's basically saying we do not support removals or reductions, and we certainly don't support companies using voluntary carbon credits. So if that's the message being sent out by organizations like the SBTI, where is your demand for voluntary carbon credits going to come from?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting as that people seem to not just people, organizations, huge bureaucracies, massive entities, let's say, operating in the world, seem to have missed the point entirely, which is the point being that the market can do this the fastest way. I mean, we know that to be true. That's been proven in all kinds of situations throughout history. And yet, all of these efforts to seemingly stall the market from moving the capital, which is exactly what's needed, right? Is to those market signals so that the capital is invested in the outcomes that everyone's looking for. It's just fascinating how it's being pummeled on all sides. It's just very interesting and puzzling, really.
I think it's puzzling because it defies common sense. It, most of us who are in the financial markets recognize that the most effective way in which we can achieve the overall climate objective is to decarbonize. But we all recognize that decarbonization is going to cost us a lot of money. So actually what we have to do is be sensible about how we spend that money, and we have to prioritize the easy wins in the meantime, right? Because okay,
Yeah.
you can get carbon capture and storage subsidized when the carbon price is $200 a ton. But today carbon is $80 a ton, and even that is a complaint for most European companies, right? So actually, even a rich nation like Europe doesn't want to afford 80 euros a ton at the moment. They're getting the benefit of the subsidy and the free allocation, which allows them to stomach it, but it's not a true reflection of what they can bear. So actually, when you then say the rest of the world should move towards a $200 a ton world at the same time because the EU's decided they're going to wave a stick rather than dangle a carrot, you really get into this interesting position that says you are not doing the sensible thing. You're not pursuing the lowest cost of decarbonization, which could be in afforestation credits in the global south. And you're doing so because you really have an ideological bent
Mm-hmm.
against carbon offsetting. And it's your ideological bent against carbon offsetting that is stopping you from doing the common sense thing, which is to put the best amount of resources for the best amount of environmental benefit. And you are choosing to cut your nose and spite your face because you have this ideological position on carbon offsetting. And that is
Mm-hmm.
ultimately the saddest indictment of the EU's position in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And that of many NGOs as well, unfortunately. Wow. Oh, so sad. I don't want to end on a sad note. And I know we're definitely way beyond our typical episode time, and I just thank you both for spending so much time on this today. I feel like we could probably have a whole additional episode just to talk about CORSIA, because one of the last burning questions was whether we can have a functioning CORSIA market for airlines if we don't have functioning Article 6. But what do you think? Hold that to a second episode?
I'll give you a 1 minute version on it, only because I
Okay.
do think it's an important point about the
Sure.
whole transition of voluntary markets into compliance markets. CORSIA is a very good example of the fact that you can create a unit using a completely voluntary standard like the gold standard or the VCS standard, and CORSIA will accept that unit as a unit that airlines can use towards meeting their airline compliance obligations, provided the host country that issues the credit is willing to apply a corresponding adjustment. A lot of people have said, well, if it's not an ITMO, how on earth does the country apply the corresponding adjustment? Well, CORSIA isn't a Paris Agreement treaty. CORSIA sits outside the Paris Agreement. The corresponding adjustment requirement that CORSIA, or the TAB, which is the task force approving body for authorizing body for CORSIA that chooses which units are eligible, they're the ones who've artificially borrowed a concept across from the Paris Agreement and have forced it on the host countries by saying, you want to issue a CORSIA compliant unit, you figure out how to do a corresponding adjustment. It's not like the host countries have said, you know what, I'm more than happy to extend my Paris Agreement corresponding adjustment concept, which is only limited to an Article 6 framework, and apply it in a voluntary space. So the fact is that it's the CORSIA negotiators who've artificially dumped a Paris Agreement problem on a voluntary market. And I don't know what they're trying to do. Either they're trying to say, countries, you go figure it out, or they're saying we're only going to accept Paris Agreement units. Now, I personally disagree with both positions because Article 6 units can be used for the purposes of CORSIA. It's an expensive thing to do, but you can do it. But they have to then be units issued by the 6.4 Supervisory Board, or they have to be issued through a 6.2 cooperative approach. What you're now getting is this artificial situation where people are saying, you know what, the only way I can get a CORSIA eligible ton is if I accept the concept of unilateral 6.2. And that's like, well, hang on a second. Why on earth is CORSIA telling me how to interpret the Paris Agreement? CORSIA hijacked the Paris Agreement concept, uh, artificially applied it, and only because they couldn't come up with a better way of trying to deal with what they perceived to be a double claiming or double counting problem. And now they're saying, well, you're going to use the CORSIA to interpret the Paris Agreement. So that's literally the tail wagging the dog rather than the dog wagging the tail in terms of working out what is right and what is wrong. So I have a fundamental problem with the idea that you have any particular reason why a unilaterally issued ton has to be an ITMO just because it needs to be CORSIA eligible. I don't agree with that. I think a country can do a corresponding adjustment if it chooses to do a corresponding adjustment. It doesn't have to apply it to an ITMO, because a corresponding adjustment is simply a commitment to take on an additional burden for the purposes of your NDC. That's what a corresponding adjustment is. It's not a magic thing that converts one unit into another. It does within the framework of the Paris Agreement. Outside the Paris Agreement, it does nothing of the sort.
Definitely, I think we could have another episode diving deeper on that. But thank you so much for sharing your position. I think this is such deep food for thought. We will include the links, obviously, to Peter's February paper, but also I'll get the link to the one you read from so that folks can take a deeper look. And of course, our usual acronym glossary is available at ClimeCo.com. If you're just learning the space and your head was spinning with all the acronyms, you can access our glossary at ClimeCo.com. Anna, do you have anything else to wrap up here?
No, I just think it's a fascinating topic, and it leaves us with a lot of questions, and especially as we are seeing these credits come to market now. Like I said, I would really appreciate to have a follow-up conversation on the risks that we are seeing, that buyers are buying credits now with LOAs, but we don't know exactly when they're going to get a corresponding adjustment, or if at all. There are lots of outstanding questions, I think, but a lot of food for thought. We take that away. We do what Peter does and have a little bit of time to digest it all.
Yes.
And hopefully we'll come back for more.
Yes.
We can always have another session.
Peter, thank you. This has been phenomenal, and I definitely want to take you up on the second session.
Whether you're a seasoned ESG practitioner or embarking on your sustainability journey, ESG Decoded is your trusted source for inspiration and actionable insights for responsible business practices. Subscribe on your favorite streaming platforms to be notified of new episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday mornings, and connect with us at ESG Decoded on social media or by visiting www.climeco.com.